Greetings, night adventurers. Put on your headphones, close your eyes, and dive into a world of mountain adventures with me. Today, we'll explore the life of an extraordinary man, Scott Fischer. This story is based on the book Mountain Madness, the Scott Fischer story. Take a deep breath. You're home, and the adventure begins. Deep in the heart of the Olympic Mountains, among crags and eternal winds, a story began to unfold. The first steps of a long and extraordinary journey. In this wild and unforgiving land, under a ruthless sun, along steep trails and icy passes, in a silence broken only by the cry of an eagle and the clink of carabiners, a 14-year-old Scott Fischer first felt what it truly meant to stand on a summit. Not just physically, but deeply, profoundly. It was his first serious mountain trip. Together with his friends, he set off along a trail that led toward Mount Olympus, one of the most majestic peaks in Washington State's Olympic National Park. They were facing an hours-long trek, carrying gear, food, dreams, and ambition on their backs. The hot summer was deceptive. In these parts, the weather shifts in an instant. Winding paths through spruce forests and blooming alpine meadows quickly turned into narrow ridgelines cloaked in fog with wind slapping their faces. Scott walked with confidence, maybe too much confidence for his age. He moved with ease, guided by some instinctive sense of balance and rhythm. Even then, there was something bold and stubborn about him, the spirit of a future climber. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He knew where he was going. When the group reached the base of Olympus, the real challenge began. The slope was steep and slick. Rocks gave way underfoot, tumbling into the void. The wind grew sharper, and the glaciers above promised cold and danger. But Scott didn't flinch. "Stay close to the rock. Keep your weight on your legs," he said when someone began to lose confidence. He wasn't barking orders. He was leading. At just 14, he already had that kind of voice, the kind you want to follow. The final stretch was the hardest. A near vertical wall, iced over in places, demanding total focus. Fischer didn't let himself get distracted. His face was intent, but his eyes were alive. He could feel something important taking shape, something deep inside. Here, on the edge, where one wrong move could mean disaster, a person comes face to face with themselves. And then, the summit, Olympus, a high, rocky plateau with panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean and endless mountain ranges. The sun burned in his face. The air was crisp and clear. Scott stood tall, squared his shoulders, and said just one thing. "Funny, isn't it?" To the others, it was just a breathtaking view. To him, it was a revelation. The descent was no less dangerous. Their legs shook with fatigue, and the sun dipped toward the horizon. But even then, Scott remained calm and steady. This was his element, his world. He felt alive. It was on that trip, in the heights, in the silence, in the tension of every step, that Scott Fischer, the climber the world would one day call one of the boldest of his time, began to take shape. Even then he understood. Mountaineering wasn't just about going up. It was a choice, a battle with oneself, a way of life. He wasn't chasing victory. He was chasing that ultimate effort. He used to say, "It's a conscious confrontation with danger. It's the deliberate overcoming of fear. It's rising above yourself. That's where the thrill is." That day in the Olympic Mountains wasn't a headline. It didn't make the papers. But there, among the rocks and clouds, a lifelong path began. and a boy with a defiant gaze took his first step toward immortality. He didn't yet know which summits he would climb. He was just walking, steady, stubborn, with an open heart and a fire burning inside. And this was only the beginning. Winter, 1969, New Jersey. One of those quiet evenings when the family is gathered around the TV, no real plans, just flipping through channels. On screen, snow-covered ridges of Wyoming, wind-swept and wild. A camera pans across a group of teenagers with heavy backpacks, trudging through a vast white wilderness. These kids are 5 days away from the nearest shelter in one of the harshest backcountry regions in America, says the narrator. They have no food, no help is coming. Paul Petzold put them in this situation on purpose. In front of the screen sits Scott Fischer, 15 years old. He's curled up in a chair, hugging his knees, completely transfixed. The voice of Petzold, an old mountaineer, sounds like a revelation. Young people need adventure. This is a good way to get it. You ought to know your strengths and your weaknesses. The film is called A Month to Live Off the Land, and to Scott, it feels like those words are meant for him personally. "God, this is fantastic," he exclaimed. "I'd love to go," his father would later recall. The answer was simple. Then go. Save up what you can. I'll help with the rest. The deal was made. If Scott could raise half the fee, $225 of the $450 total, his father would cover the other half. The very next day, Scott took a job delivering newspapers, all for one goal: to get there, to the wilds of the Wind River Range, where teens were taught to survive. The program featured in the film was the life's work of Paul Petzold, a legendary mountaineer and founder of the National Outdoor Leadership School, NOLS. His biography read like an adventure novel. He once killed a moose with a penknife, disguised himself as a Sikh in Calcutta, walked tightropes, played water polo, and farmed alfalfa. He was a cook, a golfer, even a used car salesman. But above all, he knew how to teach. He created a program that trained not just the body, but the character. For 30 days, teens would trek through the wilds of Wyoming, learning how to navigate with a compass, cook over open fires, pitch tents, work as a team, and be alone. In the final days, they were left without food, 5 days from the nearest town. They had to forage for plants, catch fish, survive on their own. It was no longer practice. It was real. "It's a powerful incentive to learn," Petzold said. "Out in the wilderness, with only a backpack, your survival depends on your wits." In summer 1970, Scott set off on his first real expedition. Along with 750 teenagers from across the country, he arrived in the Wind River Range of Wyoming. The landscape was a sharp contrast to his hometown of Basking Ridge. No asphalt, no buildings, just mountains, wind, and blazing light. The program didn't forgive weakness. Gear was minimal. Food arrived only once every 10 days via pack horses. Otherwise, full autonomy. The teens trekked through forests, over rocks and glaciers, learning not just survival skills, but patience, leadership, and discipline. "This school is a good way to give young people adventure," said Petzold. "It's better than LSD, marijuana, or drag racing." He often recalled his own first climb of the Grand Teton at 16, barely surviving, but walking away with deep respect for the mountains. The program's final stage was a moment of truth. After 4 weeks of training, The teens were sent into the mountains for 5 days without food, just their gear and everything they'd learned. Live off the land, find your way, rely on your team. Some were frustrated, hungry, exhausted. One boy found a hidden food stash and ate it. The others chose to stick to the rules. Michael Wadley's film crew captured it all. The conflict, the fear, the growing up. Wadley would later go on to film Woodstock, but he said a month to live off the land was his real discovery. Because in that story, it wasn't about the music. It was about inner strength. Young people facing real challenges for the first time. For Scott Fischer, this journey was the beginning, the first step into a world ruled by endurance, courage, and choice. Out there, among the rocks of Wind River, he felt not just love for the mountains, but the call, the kind of call you can't ignore. It's more fun to travel, he would say later, so I'd rather go. And he did. Summer 1970, Wyoming. The dusty streets of Lander overflow with a steady stream of teenagers in faded jeans, worn-out sneakers, backpacks slung over their shoulders, and dreams shining in their eyes. Among them is a young Scott Fischer, suntanned, bold, with an intense gaze that already hints at a thirst for freedom. He hasn't come just to learn. He's come to become himself. Back then, Lander didn't feel like a town. It felt like the epicenter of a new kind of culture. This was where people came not for diplomas, but for experience. Not for comfort, but for challenge. And here, Scott found his pack. Kindred spirits who, like him, wanted to truly live. They weren't afraid of pain, cold, or risk. They wanted to survive, to climb, to fall and rise again, shouting, laughing, burning with life. Who were these kids? They became known as the Bruces. It all started as a joke. A popular Monty Python sketch at the time featured a scene where every character was named Bruce. Scott and his friends found it absurdly hilarious. At first, they just tossed the quotes around. Then the name Bruce stuck as a nickname and almost a totem. It became a signal, a word that meant one of us, someone who belonged in the mountains, someone who could hold on, crack a joke, and endure. "Bros!" someone would yell from a hilltop, and their voice would echo through the valley. Down below, another voice would answer, and another. It was a code that needed no translation. The administration's attempts to ban brucing were useless. If anything, the resistance only made it stronger. Even decades later, at alumni gatherings, someone could shout into the crowd, "Bruce!" and dozens of heads would turn. They recognized each other not by face, but by that ancient cry for freedom. Scott brought Bruce home with him to New Jersey. For him, it wasn't just a word. It was a philosophy. To be a Bruce was to be open to adventure, present in the moment, unafraid of the future. He called his friends Bruces, inspired them, united them. Anyone could be a Bruce, as long as they were ready to live for real. They lived in a trailer near waterfalls and rock slides in Sinks Canyon, not far from Lander. It became their base camp, a sanctuary from the world, a place where the Bruces baked bread, brewed coffee, argued, laughed, and planned their next routes. It was like a temple, only instead of icons, climbing carabiners hung from the walls. Paul Petzold, the legendary founder of the National Outdoor Leadership School, didn't just tolerate their defiance. He encouraged it. He trusted his students, sometimes, maybe a little too much. His credo was simple. Rules are for fools. He repeated it like a mantra. To him, If you weren't a fool, you already knew what to do. He didn't teach them how to get out of trouble. He taught them how not to get into it in the first place. And if you did, how to stay calm, gather all the information, and make decisions based not on fear, but on experience. We learned a lot about what not to do to avoid getting in trouble, recalled one former student. This was a different kind of education, a university without lectures, but with real exams, on ridgelines, in thunderstorms, at the limits of human endurance. The world of the Bruces was a universe where every day was a step into the unknown. It was where they found friends, love, and purpose. Many of them went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers. They grew up and moved on. But Scott stayed. He saw no point in college. The mountains were enough. My education, he said, is in the climbs. My university is the ridgelines of the world. To Scott, the mountain wasn't just a challenge, it was a teacher. His journey into alpinism didn't begin with a summit. It began with friendship, with the spirit of freedom, with a cry echoing across the slopes. Bruce! That's how the code was born. That's how the brotherhood began. And that's how the path was laid, the one that would one day lead Scott Fischer to altitudes where the air grows thin and every decision becomes a matter of life or death. But for now, it's summer, Sinks Canyon, a camp among the stones, and a voice calling out once more, Bruce! And that voice is never left unanswered. September had taken hold, bringing with it the first cold dawns of Wyoming. The tourist season was winding down, and for most young NOLS instructors, it meant time to pack up and reflect on the future. But not for Scott Fischer. He was only 19, yet already gripped by a vision that pulsed through his veins to live for the mountains, not as a hobby, but as a calling, a profession, a path. I've decided to become the best climber I can be, he would later tell Jenny, the girl he trusted with his thoughts. To climb harder and harder peaks until one day I just don't come back. That was the plan. Simple and brutally honest. While his classmates packed their bags and headed off to college campuses across the country, Scott was hitchhiking home to New Jersey to wish his mother a happy birthday and put on a suit for his sister Rhonda's wedding. He helped his friends prepare for school, listened to their talk of degrees and careers, but none of it resonated with him. He couldn't fake it. When his parents asked about his plans, he was direct. College didn't interest him. Of course, we tried to talk him into it, his father recalled, but he really didn't care. True to himself, Scott soon left again, hitchhiking back to Wyoming. He called Jenny from roadside phone booths, which he fondly called gift booths. In those calls, you could hear both wonder and uncertainty. He shared stories from the road, the books he was reading, tales of Swiss climbers he'd recently climbed with. He mailed her little gifts, a book on Buddhist meditation, a necklace, a stone. Once he wrote, "An old man gave me a ride today. He didn't have a dime, so I helped him out. He gave me a cowboy hat, but I don't really look like John Denver." He was trying to earn money, first at the oil fields near Casper, but none of the companies were hiring. When he was down to his last cent, he turned to a uranium mine near Jeffrey City, a last resort, a job born of desperation. "Why am I doing this? How does this bring me close to the goal?" he asked in a letter to Jenny. Then he answered himself, "To climb a lot, you need money. It's that simple. I'll deal with it. That winter became a school of survival. He kept moving forward, no safety net, like on a sheer rock face. In spring, as Wyoming began to thaw, Scott and his friends headed back into the mountains. On one expedition, he found himself on a vertical ice wall, climbing without a rope. Suddenly, as he swung his ice axe, he felt the tool grow weightless. The pick had snapped off. He was stranded on an ice column as tall as a 10-story building. No way up, no way down, no rope, just one working axe and a void below. A friend named Randy crawled over and handed him a spare tool, a colibri. But instead of backing off, Scott kept going. I hadn't climbed much with the colibri, he later admitted. It's a good tool, but it takes practice. He drove the axe into the ice, shifted his weight, and the next moment he was falling. Suddenly, he was gone, said Wes, another climber. 1 second, and Scott just vanished from sight. Randy lunged, trying to grab him. Too late. Scott slammed into a lower ledge, tumbled, and disappeared. He survived. But that moment captured the essence of who he was, to keep going, especially when there's no rope. For Scott, it wasn't just a moment, it was a way of life. No harnesses, no guarantees, no padded landings. He moved forward powered by will, instinct, and faith in his own hands. He didn't want easy. He didn't accept compromise. His summits had to be earned. This chapter of his life was one of the first where everything got real. The dream stopped being a romantic idea and became a job. A cold, hard, sometimes dangerous job, but a real one. Scott chose his path alone, without a rope, and he never looked back. Far from Everest and the glaciers of the Himalayas, beneath the shadow of America's rugged mountain ranges, begins a story filled with wild freedom, dusty roads, and youthful defiance. Scott Fischer hadn't yet reached the heights where the air rings thin and sharp. But even at the very start of his path, one thing was clear. He wasn't like everyone else. He was the kind of person who didn't follow the trail. He followed the direction of the wind. After finishing high school, Scott made a firm decision. He wouldn't go to college. Instead, he saved up a little money, bought a photo book of alpine panoramas, and gave it to Jenny, the girl he was especially close with. "I'll bring you a stone from the top of the Alps," he wrote her in a letter. "You can follow my climbs using this book. And when I come back, we'll open it together and I'll say, yes, I was here, and here, and here." It was their pact, a small ritual that turned romance into purpose and a dream into a plan. And then he went further. Scott set off hitchhiking across Europe and Asia. His future Everest climbing partner, Brent Bunnell, would later recall, "It's pretty incredible when some kid from backwoods New Jersey, with just a couple semesters of school under his belt, hitchhikes all the way to Asia." That's more interesting than most Everest expedition stories. In the evenings, while something sizzled over the fire and a pot of stew bubbled gently nearby, Scott would share bits of that journey. His stories were like fire themselves, a little crackling and full of warmth. He spoke of Europe, of buses and trains, of sticking out his thumb on unfamiliar roads, all for the chance to one day see the Himalayas. "We didn't actually climb any of those mountains," he'd say with a shrug, "but we gave it a pretty good shot." Then he'd smile just a little and quietly hum to himself, like in the Bob Seger song, "I'm going to Kathmandu. That's really where I'm going to Kathmandu." But the real magic of this chapter wasn't in the routes or the mountains. It was in how a legend is born, how a kid wandering across Europe becomes a climber in search of himself. The Rainbow Gathering, a strange, serendipitous meeting place for those chasing not just work or summits, but their path. Bruce, his future climbing brother, ended up there by accident, picked up by a purple hippie van at South Pass near Mount Frink. It wasn't just a few days of freedom. It was a crossroads of lives. Soon after, Bruce met Paul Petzold, the founder of NOLS, and was offered a spot in the summer program. Sometime later, in a bar in Lander, he met Scott. They hit it off immediately. Scott was searching. He had just graduated and hoped that after the summer course at Petzold School, he could stay in the Rockies. But life had other plans. By February, he found himself working in a uranium mine. Bruce, too, started working there. A harsh reality, but part of the training. Down there, in the deep stillness between light and dark, Scott was developing skills just as vital as any learned on a mountain. Patience, endurance, and inner silence. And somewhere between all those moments, a book, a promise, a glance toward the horizon, out there, far away, the Eiger, the Matterhorn, Mont Blanc, and Kathmandu, still just words on a map, but already pulsing with the heartbeat of someone who, one day, would climb higher than most, and maybe, just maybe, stay there forever, in the memory of others. Scott Fischer, a man the world came to know after the tragedy on Everest, but those who knew him personally spoke of something else entirely. He wasn't famous because of how he died. He was legendary because he survived a dozen falls that should have killed him. Writer Sebastian Junger once recalled signing up for a course at the National Outdoor Leadership School, where Fischer was one of the instructors. He watched in awe as Scott climbed terrifying cracks without a rope high above the camp, like a figure from some ancient myth, moving with such confidence and intent that one almost felt sorry for the rock, forced to endure such a bold intrusion. He climbed like he couldn't fall, Junger wrote, but of course he did fall, and not just once. In Yosemite, he fell from a height of nearly 30 feet, hit a tree, blacked out, and somehow lived. Later, on the frozen Bridal Veil Falls, he found himself in the air again. It happened during a seminar led by legendary climber Jeff Lowe. Scott and a group of instructors had gathered in Provo Canyon, Utah, to learn the emergent art of ice climbing, a discipline where climbers battle walls of ice instead of rock. There, in those glittering, frigid canyons, Scott wielded ice axes and screws to ascend frozen waterfalls. But he made a crucial mistake. He didn't check his protection point. Under the weight of his body, it ripped from the crack. Scott fell. He slammed face first into the wall, and by sheer miracle landed on a patch of soft snow, a rare cushion in a landscape of stone and ice. It saved his life, but he fractured his hip and lost consciousness. His sister Lisa, who had been attending the course, stayed by his side until the rescue helicopter arrived. He was in really bad shape, she later recalled, covered in blood and dirt. It was terrifying. By the time his parents reached the hospital, Scott had regained consciousness. "Geez," he said, "looks like I'm in some deep trouble." After being discharged, he returned to New Jersey to recover. But this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. While climbing in the Wind River Range, he once fell 30 meters into a crevasse, dislocating his shoulder. Later, he re-injured it in Colorado. There were more falls in Zion, in the Shawangunks, ending in bruises, sprains, and close calls. And then Yosemite again. Another violent break between man and earth. Once again, the rope saved him. And once again, he kept climbing. The golden rule of climbing. Never trust a piece of protection unless you checked it yourself. But Scott often broke that rule. He trusted himself. Sometimes, too much. He didn't always fall alone. There were other moments. On one course, not long after recovering from a previous injury, Scott fell again. Randy Atten, a young climber, was belaying him from below. The crack was tricky, full of treacherous holes. Scott slipped and dropped nearly 20 feet. The rope snapped Randy off the ground, and they both hung there face to face. "Nice catch," Scott said with a grin. Scott lived on the edge. He knew every mistake could be the last. But he kept going, and not just for himself. One day during a course, 2 students told him they had completed a climb without a rope. When he learned that one of them had led a tough pitch solo, he exploded. "Don't ever do that again," he barked, terrifying them. For Scott, risk was his own choice. But if a student put themselves in danger, it was unforgivable. They recalled that his ankle had still been healing from a recent fall. It moved in an odd way, but he was back on the rock, climbing again. That was Scott. He wasn't chasing death. He was chasing height. And every time he emerged from another fall, it was as if he was saying to the world, "I'm still here." The Alaska factor. It wasn't just a geographic label. It was a feeling, a sense that everything was bigger, harsher, and more unpredictable than it seemed at first glance. When Scott Fischer, along with his friends from Mountain Madness, arrived in Talkeetna, a tiny town at the base of Denali, he was ready for the challenge. But, as always in Alaska, nature had its own plans. For 2 days straight, he, Jenny Price, and a few others were stuck in a lodge, a bar packed with climbers, neon flickering, and a cold, snowy sky outside the windows. The mountains were out of reach, and although they were all used to bad weather in tents, waiting down below in civilization was far more torturous. When Jenny announced that the skies wouldn't clear for at least another day, the group groaned and ordered another round of beers. "It's going to be fun," Scott said. "Murray, Jenny, Michael Allison, we'll ski, we'll climb, and you'll see what the North is really like." His voice was full of energy. Scott had a way of infecting others with his confidence like no one else. The next morning, they made their way to the airstrip, slush squelching underfoot, backpacks sinking into the muck. The air hung heavy with anticipation. Those who had lost to Scott in a board game the night before cast sideways glances in his direction. "People blow money in bars all the time," muttered bearded Jeff Murray, loading his gear into the plane. His silver crown glinted in the morning light, curls whipping in the wind. He was a Minnesota kid who'd gone on YMCA expeditions above the Arctic Circle, living, like Scott, to the rhythm of adventure. When they finally reached base camp at the foot of Denali, the world opened up in a way that was completely other, vast, overwhelming, almost alien. At first, it all seemed easy. They had food, fuel, time to ski and climb around camp. But distances in Alaska were deceptive. What looked close often turned out to be a 3-hour slog. Even here, Scott couldn't sit still. He skied long routes, challenged the ridges, burned through energy, as if testing the core of his being. But even he had begun to face different kinds of questions. Maybe we could have a home, he wrote to Ginny in a letter. He dreamed of a stereo system, of fixing the car, of something simple, something human. Between the lines, you could sense a quiet longing for roots, a feeling that rarely coexisted with the image of a man forever chasing summits. For the first time, Scott began to picture himself not just as a climber, but as someone who might need a place to return to. It felt almost forbidden, but Alaska, with its silence and sheer scale, invited such thoughts. Here, loneliness didn't crush. It cleansed. The snowy expanse didn't demand answers, only presence. You were either there or you weren't. Alaska was a high-stakes game, but the stakes weren't points or money. They were survival, raw and uncompromising, and Scott had instinct, an incredible instinct to survive. In the moments when everything collapsed, he pulled himself together and fought fiercely, fearlessly, as if each motion carried the message, I have to make it. His motto at the time was simple, just do it. But over time, his friends rephrased it. How the hell did that just happen? Because watching Scott in action, it was often impossible to understand how he was still alive. Those days beneath Denali, where time moved to the rhythm of glaciers, Scott Fischer wasn't just preparing for another summit. He was testing himself like never before. And maybe, just maybe, it was here, among the icy winds and endless skies, that the most important expedition of his life began. One that didn't lead upward, but inward. On the slopes of Denali, beneath Alaska's bright, icy sun, one of the most unusual ideas in the climbing world was quietly taking shape. The name came quickly, bold and unforgettable, Mountain Madness. And the motto? As simple and audacious as Scott Fischer himself. Just do it. Later, they'd laugh and reword it. How the hell did that happen? But in that moment, in the white silence of the northern continent, everything felt possible. Scott believed that with the right people by your side, things would fall into place. And more often than not, they did. The idea to start his own company came to Scott back in 1974. That same year, he first mentioned it to Ginny, his partner at the time. And that was when the name was born, Mountain Madness. 3 years later, Ginny helped design the first business card, a silhouette of a mountain with the moon rising behind it. The logo became a target for teasing. Friends joked it looked more like an oil spill or an orca playing with a beach ball. But the bright yellow t-shirts already bore the bold lettering, Mountain Madness. Scott Fischer and Friends. Scott felt he had outgrown Petzold School and was ready to move on. The move to Seattle marked a new beginning. He wanted to do things his way, loud, bold, and unapologetic. Alongside his friend and partner, Woos Krause, they set out to build not just a business, but a philosophy. Woos had just wrapped up a contract with Outward Bound in Kenya. He was ready for something new. Together, they wanted to create adventures others could fall in love with. But first, they had to survive their own. Their first real test came in the Himalayas, beneath the Fang in the Annapurna Massif. Woos tore his Achilles tendon. The descent from the ridge was agony. A vertical mile down, battered bodies, hunger. They limped into a village and ate as much as they could until they'd finished off every chicken. And still, Woos would say, the summit is the goal, but the adventure matters just as much. At the Mountain Madness office, The history wall was framed with a climbing rope, photos pinned along it like a timeline of wild ideas, friends, and expeditions. Woods pointed to a shot from Kilimanjaro where he and Scott had just crossed a sheet of glacial ice. Smiles, tired eyes, joy. That was the moment they both felt it. This is the start of something bigger. By 1984, the company was officially registered. In Seattle, where climbing was booming and mountaineers were becoming celebrities, Mountain Madness began to gain momentum. Scott didn't want to sneak clients up Mount Rainier in secret. He wanted recognition, slideshows, and stories of real adventure. He knew only big expeditions would build a recognizable brand. They were inspired by the whitewater model, like Sobek, which sent people rafting down wild rivers. Mountain Madness would lead people into the mountains, not for conquest, but for experience. Guides would lead, clients would participate. This wasn't tourism, this was a journey. That's why, when it came time to choose a route up Kilimanjaro, they picked the hardest one, Breckenridge Ridge. Only one guide had ever tried leading a team up it. "If we go up the normal route, no one will remember us," Scott said. They wanted glory. They needed a challenge. And their trips had everything: romance, recklessness, survival, friendship, failure, and triumph. They weren't just building a climbing school. They were building a way of life, attention to detail, atmosphere of adventure, total immersion. Their mission was clear: to share what had inspired them. Mountain Madness became more than just a project. It was Scott Fischer's answer to the world. Mount Kilimanjaro, a solitary colossus rising from the plains of Tanzania like a mirage. It has no foothills, no neighbors among lesser peaks. From a distance, the Kibo Massif appears smooth and symmetrical, but from within, it's jagged, severe, and unpredictable. This volcano once collapsed part of its caldera, leaving behind a foreboding area known as the Western Breach, home to one of the most dangerous walls in Africa, the Breach Wall. Majestic and intimidating, it rises more than 1,200 meters from the Barranco Valley to the summit, flanked by the Boleto and Diamond glaciers, with a narrow, fragile bridge of ice suspended between them, a ribbon of glacier 90 meters high. In 1984, Scott Fischer and his friend Wes Krause set their sights on this wall, a route that had only ever been climbed once before, and since then, no one had dared attempt it again. Before the climb, Fischer and Krause immersed themselves in the spirit of the place. They spent several days acclimatizing in Kibo Crater, summited via the standard route, peered into the smoldering cone, and admired the massive glaciers. They were thrilled to be back in the mountains and to be on the verge of an attempt that would demand everything they had in skill, strength, and endurance. Even if they failed to scale the breach wall, spending the night atop Africa already felt like a victory. A local guide named Kishingo led them down the western slopes. The descent was steep, foggy, visibility near zero, the sound of their steps swallowed by the thick, damp air. When Wes remarked, "I think we're lost," Kishingo replied calmly, "I know exactly where we are." He wasn't just any guide. He had once assisted Reinhold Messner himself in preparations for a climb on the same route. When Fischer heard that, he grinned. Good Bruce karma. Preparations took several days. Porters carried their gear to the far side of the mountain, while the trio, Fischer, Krause, and Kishingo, climbed the meringue route to the summit, then descended to the start of the wall. Their challenge lay ahead: to traverse the Boleto Glacier, ascend the treacherous ice bridge, and finish the climb via the Diamond Glacier. On the map, the line looked intimidating. Eyewitnesses said the ice bridge looked like Christmas tinsel, so delicate, so thin. But Fischer and Krause didn't dramatize it. They were confident. They were young, strong, and hungry for the climb. They knew if they wanted to play in the top league of alpinism, their resume needed a route like the Breach Wall. The climb began. The first day was brutal. Bitter cold, unstable ice, avalanche-prone slopes, unpredictable weather. They moved upward step by painstaking step, cutting holes into the ice, carving a path where almost no one had gone before. At one point, a pack got stuck on a ledge, and Krause, exhausted but determined, hurled rocks at it until it came loose. Then he climbed up himself, gear on his back, ascending vertical ice, pushing through fatigue and fear. They reached a snowfield near the top of the ice column. The slope eased slightly, and after a brief rest on a rock ledge, where they melted snow for water, they pressed on toward the summit. They reached Uhuru Peak, Kilimanjaro's highest point, at sunset. The sun dipped below the clouds as a nearly full moon rose behind it, bright enough that they didn't need headlamps. On the descent, they made their way to the Kibo hut, exhausted but elated. In his journal, Wes wrote, "Francis was very glad to see us. We were a bit late, but happy. The climb was magnificent." Fischer would revisit that route in his thoughts many times. He'd say, "What was I even hanging on to? My weight?" Then he'd add, "There's no way I'd ever do that route again." And for the next 5 years, no one else even tried. That climb, for Fischer and Krause, could have been the end, but it was a beginning. They proved they could take on the most technically demanding, dangerous routes and hold their own among the best climbers in the world. Their ascent of Kilimanjaro's ice bridge remains almost unmentioned in mountaineering lore. But they were there. They did it. And they came back. It all began with a photograph. Friends of Wes Krause, just back from Nepal, were showing pictures of the towering peaks around the Annapurna region. Among them was something unusual, a mountain with a jagged silhouette, sharp like a predator's tooth. Its nickname fit, the Fang. Officially, it was Baraha Shikar, or Annapurna Fang, standing at 7,647 meters. Wes immediately sent the photo to Scott Fischer, along with a note. This mountain was made to be climbed. And you know the best part? The permit costs only $900. In 1984, Scott Fischer, Wes Krause, and Joe Helsick, another instructor from Petzold School, decided to take on the Fang. They planned to climb alpine style, no series of high camps, no oxygen, no army of porters. Just the three of them, their packs, and a wall that soared into the sky. But the mountain already had a grim history. In 1979, an Austrian team turned back after one of their climbers died. Later that same year, an Italian expedition, 20 climbers, 250 porters, spent a month on the slopes, only to retreat under relentless avalanches and brutal weather. Only in 1980 did alpine guide Sepp Mayerl and his partner reach the summit. Since then, the mountain had remained virtually untouched. Scott and Wes took the challenge seriously. They pored over the Austrians' reports, written in German, studying every detail, learning how the route moved. It had taken the Austrians 35 days to summit. The Americans thought, We can do it faster. That's what Alpine style demanded, and they were ready. The first thing that struck them upon arriving in Nepal was the scale, a scale no photo could convey. The valleys, the climbs, even reaching the base of the Phong took days of punishing effort. Physical fatigue soon turned into exhaustion. The weather gave no breaks. Snow, wind, wild temperature swings. The slopes were unstable. Avalanches thundered through nearby couloirs. Even Joe, experienced as he was, struggled with acclimatization. Scott and Wes, too, began to feel they were operating at their absolute limits. One day during the ascent, Wes injured his leg. He kept going, but the pain grew worse. Finally, they reached the ridge, the first place where they could actually see the summit. And it became clear they wouldn't make it. Not in this condition, not in this weather, not with this level of uncertainty about the route. They descended, battered, exhausted, but alive. Back in the U.S., Scott later wrote in his journal, "The Fang beat us. We had enough experience, we were well prepared, but we underestimated the scale of the Himalayas. Next time, we won't make the same mistakes. Next time, we'll climb the highest mountain in the world." He missed the mark by just a decade. Back then, it was winter in Montana, and in the Krause family kitchen, years after the expedition, the story still lived on. Children's drawings covered the table. Chicks chirped under a lamp in the corner. Wes, speaking with a rare kind of calm, said, "Later, I'd look at that mountain and think, what the hell was I doing up there?" He'd point out the route to his kids, show them the exact point where they turned back, and add, they'd look at me and say, "Dad, you were both crazy." His voice held no drama, only wonder, as if even now he still couldn't quite believe how far they'd gone. He still limped from that climb. A torn Achilles tendon, later confirmed by doctors, had required surgery. And yet, by spring of the following year, he was back on Kilimanjaro with the very surgeon who had treated him. The Phong stayed behind them, but in that expedition, like in a single drop of water, all the future principles of Fischer and Krause were reflected. Determination, faith in lightweight climbing, faith in themselves. They had failed and survived, and they came out stronger. The Fang taught them something, and it made them ready for the summits that still lay ahead. Summer 1986, the Caucasus Mountains. In the shadow of Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe, an unexpected celebration unfolds among the alpine camps of the Soviet Union. Beneath the watchful eyes of stern mountains and even sterner officials, an international climbers camp brings together teams from Austria, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and, of course, the USSR. Among them, a group of Americans, including Scott Fischer and his friends. Inside the Soviet hotel that houses the climbers, music is thumping, and in the warm blur of evening, Americans find themselves dancing or shaking with Soviet women on the disco floor. The word for dancing here is simple, popliasat, to have a little dance. Beer flows freely, and the mood is almost carefree. Until a man in a black suit and dark sunglasses steps in, he cuts the music, points his finger, and says sternly, "You are having too much fun, way too much." The moment, though absurd, will be remembered as a symbol. In the Soviet Union, even the happiest scene always had someone watching. The man in black gives a reluctant nod. The music resumes, but he remains in the corner, a shadowed reminder of the boundaries never far from sight. The next morning, one of the Americans, the narrator, woke up in pain, a swollen, injured leg from the day before. A Soviet doctor arrived with an assistant, a striking young Russian woman with braided hair. While she gently cleaned a cut on his forehead, the doctor rubbed his ankle with a strong-smelling camphor salve, then wrapped it tightly with a bandage. When he pulled it tight, a little too tight, the American let out a curse. Not angry, just hurting. The doctor, unbothered, said simply, "Don't touch the bandage for 2 weeks. In 14 days, you'll be fine." But neither bandages nor orders could keep him in the room. Limping slightly, he unwrapped the wrap and returned to the party. Music thundered again. Sasha and Marina, a Russian couple, danced like nothing had happened. Scott handed his friend a beer. Soon, someone made a familiar joke. Time to trade cotton for titanium, a clear nod to the unofficial gear swaps that often took place among climbers back then. Among the Soviet climbers was Lesha, tall, strong, and by his teammates' accounts, one of the best. He was training for a major competition, one that could earn him the rank of Soviet Master of Sport and a future as an instructor. But Lesha didn't have proper boots, no good jacket, no windbreaker. Sasha, eyeing the American's gear, made an offer, Lesha's entire kit, in exchange for a single American ice screw. Deals like this weren't rare. Soviet climbers valued foreign gear immensely. It was almost impossible to find in the USSR. For the Americans, it was a chance to help and maybe to connect on a human level across the invisible wall of the Cold War. One American suffered a serious leg injury. Even so, he kept returning to the dance floor, hobbling, joking, smiling through the pain. But the next day, it became clear you could only flirt with Soviet rules and mountains for so long. One night, someone muttered a phrase that would become the unofficial epigraph to their entire time there. It's fun until somebody dies. The mountains, like the systems that surrounded them, could tolerate much. But one day, they always answered back. That night of dancing in the heart of the Caucasus, half comedy, half farce, would become, in hindsight, a theatrical interlude in Scott Fischer's fate. And also a reminder, beyond the disco lay real summits. And for those, the price was very real. By 1986, Scott Fischer had already spent over 15 years in the mountains. Behind him were some of the hardest routes, punishing altitudes, months spent on the slopes of glaciers and sheer granite walls. He was one of those people who felt truly alive only on the edge, where every step was a challenge and every mistake could be the end. Up until this point, he'd been lucky. None of his climbing partners had died. But as the saying goes, you can joke with the mountains many times, but one day they answer back. There are simple facts. Sometimes climbers don't come back. There are too many enemies up high: avalanches, thin air, biting cold, storms, illness, exhaustion. And then there's gravity, a constant, merciless reminder that you don't belong to the summits. Scott understood the risks. He'd survived danger on Mount Drum in Alaska. With Wes Krause, he had escaped a desperate situation in Nepal, on the peak they called the Fang. He'd saved a Japanese climber, Toshi, on Aconcagua, when high-altitude sickness struck. Scott managed to drag him down to safety, and Toshi lived. Within the team, Toshi even became slang for a failed attempt or a bad climb, but those were all near misses, moments when death missed its shot. And then came peak communisme, the first death that stayed with him, the first mountain madness client to die in his arms. That chapter began with dancing and Soviet-style celebration. The Caucasus, a Soviet hotel, a disco under Mount Elbrus, music, girls, local beer. Everything was light and easy until the man in the black suit and sunglasses stepped in. "You are having too much fun," he said, shutting off the music. They promised to behave. The music came back, and he melted into the shadows, watching. That's how the summer passed, bright, chaotic, unforgettable. But then came the day. On peak communisme, Scott was leading an expedition. One of the climbers, Steve Manfredo, began to fade. At first, just mild fatigue, then heavy breathing, swelling. High-altitude sickness took hold, and fast. Scott stayed with him the entire time. He tried everything, every trick, every hope. Nothing worked. Steve died, not in an avalanche, not from a fall. He simply faded, while Scott held him. No jokes, no nicknames, no shared team slang, just pain and silence. It was the first death, and it changed everything. Scott didn't speak of it often, but when he did, he would fall quiet, staring into the distance, lost in thought. He knew the mountains could kill, and he kept going back anyway. Maybe because that was the price you paid to feel truly alive. A warehouse on the outskirts of Seattle. Scott Fischer sat cross-legged among towering stacks of heavy wooden crates, slowly crossing off items from a long list resting on his knee. The crates had been carefully waxed to protect their contents from moisture on the long journey ahead, by sea, by rail, by truck, and finally on the backs of Tibetan yaks. Inside was everything 15 climbers would need to spend months confronting the brutal elements of Everest's north face. Fischer was preparing to head to the northern side of Chomolungma, Tibet. This wasn't just an ambitious expedition. It was a return to the beginning. It was from this very side that British expeditions first attempted Everest in the 1920s. Here, on the northeast ridge, Mallory and Irvine were last seen in 1924, disappearing into the mist of legend. Scott knew that history. He felt it. He was walking in the footsteps of ghosts. Before departure, he stopped by a store to pick up a few personal items, diapers and baby formula. New fatherhood hadn't left his mind for a moment, not even on the eve of the biggest climb of his career. When the team arrived in Tibet, the approach to base camp looked like scenes from an old adventure film. Yak herders, narrow mountain roads, dust-caked trucks, the brilliant high-altitude sky, and in the distance, the immense white face of Everest, looming like a god carved from light and ice. They set up Camp 1 at around 5,800 meters, near the foot of the north face. From there, the porters stayed behind, and the climbers began hauling gear and food themselves. To speed the process, they used skis. But under the blazing sun, the glacier turned into a reflective furnace. Each carry up and down was a trial by fire and ice. The lower face was a mix of rock and ice. Above that, the white limb, an enormous snowfield prone to avalanches. The slope was steep, steep enough that even the slightest misstep could send a climber plummeting hundreds of meters. Above it towered the Great Couloir, a natural gully drawing a direct line toward the summit. The plan called for 3 intermediate camps. Scott and his longtime partner, Bruce Hildebrand, were climbing together again. "We were back as a team, just like on the Fang and Kilimanjaro," Bruce later recalled. They led the way, fixing lines, blazing the route, carving steps, doing the hard work so the rest of the team could follow safely on Jamar's. It was exhausting, punishing work, but to Fischer, this was how real climbing was meant to be. They dug snow caves, shelters capable of withstanding even major avalanches. The snow provided insulation, keeping the cold out and the warmth in. These icy burrows became temporary homes in a world ruled by wind and white. The weather was volatile. Every day could be the last. One climber, Steve Manfredo, fell ill. He was evacuated using a makeshift sled and rushed to a hospital. Days later came the news. Steve had died. Doctors found an undiagnosed lung condition and an enlarged heart. The loss hit the entire team hard. Fischer was silent for a long time when speaking of it later. He had always believed it wouldn't happen to him, that he was strong enough, smart enough, lucky enough to always make it back. But now, something had changed. He was going higher still, into a zone where death becomes a routine companion. The north face of Everest forgives nothing. From the first steps, the route becomes a battle. Vertical ice, frozen cracks, overhanging cornices. Every move demanded focus. Fischer and Hildebrand made repeated climbs to Camp 2, testing the route, sleeping in their hand-dug snow caves. Sometimes they descended to rest. More often, they stayed high. They lived in a harsh reality where each morning began the same. Crawl out of a freezing sleeping bag, lace up boots turned stiff with frost, and move upward, toward the wall, toward the summit. The climb became a ritual of pain, silence, and endless snow. Scott remained calm, focused. He made no grand speeches. He just kept going, as if walking straight toward himself. Each rope he fixed, each cave he carved, wasn't just part of the route. It was part of a deeper journey. This wasn't just an ascent of Everest. It was an act of survival, an act of belief. The wall, the cold, the altitude, they all merged into something greater, something before which a person stood utterly exposed. But in that vulnerability was all the strength in the world. Evening in Seattle. The darkening sky shimmered across the windshield as Scott Fischer drove, full of energy, momentum, and purpose. He was racing down the highway, heading to meet a group of scouts, ready to share slides from his recent Everest expedition. It had only been 4 months since his return from the Himalayas, but life was already moving fast again. The phone at his Mountain Madness office never stopped ringing. Calls from universities, tour agencies, climbing groups from all over the world. One call was from students at Baylor University, planning a month-long trip to Russia. They needed a guide. Others came from companies in Bolivia looking to organize climbs. Scott, with characteristic fire, would say, "That mountain's practically in my backyard, and I'm not allowed to guide there. Come on." He was exploring options for a concession on Rainier and permits for guiding on Denali, which had been held for years by the same companies. But behind the buzz and energy was a deeper experience. Everest, 1988, wasn't just a summit, it was a test. During the climb, Scott ran into bureaucratic trouble in China. He had to pay a fine to get his passport back, a situation he felt was deeply unfair. Still, the expedition ended without casualties, despite harsh weather and disputes over leadership style. He gained invaluable experience in logistics, group dynamics, and high-altitude decision-making. And yet, as Everest faded into memory, one question stayed with him. How does the mountain affect the human body? With fellow climbers Wally Berg and Peter Atherton, Scott joined a unique, government-funded research study. At a facility in Beltsville, they underwent full physiological testing, bone density scans, body fat analysis, metabolic evaluations. They slept in sealed chambers as scientists monitored every detail. We slept in these special pressurized rooms where they tracked our physiology, Wally recalled. They measured our metabolism down to the smallest detail. Scott, as always, radiated confidence. They didn't approach it like tourists. They showed up like pros. Pressed slacks, clean shirts, jackets. They looked the part. We liked looking professional, said Wally. We thought of ourselves as athletes. That mattered. Back in Nepal, the team set off on the Khumbu Trek, one of the world's most iconic approaches to Everest. The spring sun lit up the terraced fields, the fresh green of the hills. Children peeked from the windows of tea houses. Handwritten menus offered tea, chicken, potatoes, eggs. Polished stone trails gleamed underfoot, worn smooth by decades of porter's boots and yak hooves. But this wasn't just trekking. This was part of a new kind of expedition, a commercial one, with clients. Scott observed how Nepal was changing, how the Sherpas were turning homes into hotels. He realized mountaineering wasn't what it used to be, but he also believed it could still be real if you climbed it right. They were also experimenting with pulse oximeters. Climber Rob Hess recalled, Scott's oxygen saturation was 58, mine was 64. At sea level, we'd basically be dead. But we weren't sick. We were just nearly 9 kilometers up without oxygen. And that said everything about the physical and mental resilience of the team. For Scott, this climb marked a turning point. He felt ready for something more, not just to climb, but to create. The vision for his own company became real. Bright yellow shirts with a mountain silhouette and rising moon stamped with Mountain Madness. Scott Fischer and Friends. They became the symbol of that dream. Over the years, his passion for mountains evolved into something bigger, a mission to make mountaineering accessible but authentic. I always wanted to get paid for my effort, he said. I'm not asking for much. Just let me guide people up a mountain I know like my own backyard. That chapter of his life was closing. Everest was behind him. Ahead, new routes, new challenges, and a new philosophy. But one thing hadn't changed. That pulsing desire to live on the edge. After a grueling Himalayan expedition, Scott Fischer returned home, exhausted but unbroken. Inside him stirred a quiet doubt. Was it all for nothing? He had spent 10 weeks in the mountains, and yet Everest's summit remained out of reach. No one could say what would come next, but Scott already knew. Next season, he would try again. Still, spring was a long way off, and deep inside, the familiar itch had already returned. That longing every climber knows, the pull of the mountains. During these months, Scott found himself reconnecting with an old friend, Bruce. Memories surfaced of their early days working at a scout ranch in New Mexico, where they lived for weeks in the wilderness, fishing for trout among the hills and pines. Bruce was now an established guide, a path Scott had long aspired to. They hadn't seen each other in years, but now they were back, over mugs of tea, old photos, and long conversations about peaks and plans. A shared passion, a shared history, and a new idea. They set out for Nepal, not for fame, but for the adventure. Their target, was Langtang Lirung, a dramatic 7,000-meter peak rising in the north of the country. Here, the slopes rise directly from the villages, stretching toward the sky without the long, gradual approaches of other ranges. At the base lay the land of yaks and herders. In a small stone hut, once used by nomads, Scott and Bruce made their base. They burned the wood left behind by previous travelers, and when that ran out, dried yak dung. They conserved fuel like the locals did. At high altitude, every stick of firewood is worth its weight in gold. At some point, Scott fell ill. He stayed in the hut while Bruce hiked to the village of Goratabella to find medicine. But while Bruce was away, Scott began to feel better, and something deeper began to stir. The mountaineer's instinct, alone, no ropes, no permits, no protection. He packed a small bag, gear, a little food, and headed up. The snow line was higher than he expected. He pitched his tent at dusk. Morning came cold and windy, but Scott continued upward, drawn toward a cirque. Through the crisp, clear air, he spotted a line on the slope, a possible route to the ridge. He didn't know if it would go, but he knew one thing: the mountain was calling. He also knew he'd gone too high, without enough preparation or backup. And so he turned around. Back at the hut, Bruce had returned with the medicine. When Scott told him about the route, his friend's eyes lit up. The next day, Bruce went up himself, reaching roughly the same spot where Scott had spent the night. It was the highest he had ever been. The air felt too thin. His body felt foreign. All he wanted was to lie down and sleep. But he forced himself to turn back. December came, the cold crept in. The wind, slicing through the rock corridors, carried its message. It was time to leave. But before departing, Scott told Jenny, the woman waiting for him at home, "Nepal is incredible. You can't describe these mountains. They're massive, our American peaks. They're like toys compared to these." And yet, in those toys, he had left part of himself. He had traveled thousands of miles in search of the mountain, only to find himself at the foot of another, not the one. But maybe that was the point. The mistake that opens a new horizon. The detour that becomes destiny. The beginning hidden inside a fleeting failure. As Scott Fischer's plans for new expeditions gathered momentum, his true passion for the mountains, for altitude, for adventure, would sometimes take a back seat to something deeper. Now and then, in the middle of discussing climbing routes or flipping through photos of glaciers, he'd suddenly jump up and say, "Wait, you haven't met my kids? You have to meet them. They're amazing." At the Mountain Madness office, located on the top floor of a Seattle building with wide south-facing windows letting in the downtown light, the atmosphere was unmistakably shaped by adventure. Shelves overflowed with brochures, climbing gear, and stacks of bright yellow company t-shirts. In Scott's own office, instead of a polished executive desk, there was a battered handmade work table buried in papers. The walls were covered in photos, sweeping landscapes, Sherpa faces, shots from expeditions, and of course, family snapshots. They weren't arranged in any particular order. They tumbled and overlapped like Fischer's life itself, wild, full, constantly in motion. If you happened to catch Scott in the office, he was almost always on the phone, fired up about the next expedition. Despite falling short of Everest's summit that past spring, he felt that 1991 would be his year. In the fall of 1990, his wife Jenny, gave birth to their second child, Katie Rose. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the baby came 6 weeks early. The very night Jenny returned home from the hospital, Katie's temperature dropped suddenly. It was serious, potentially life-threatening. Jenny, exhausted from labor and sleepless nights, was at the edge of collapse. Scott looked at her and said, "Go to bed. I'll stay with her." He settled onto the couch with his daughter in his arms and spoke softly to her. "Okay, Katie Rose, we need to have a little talk. We need to warm you up." While Jenny slept, Scott held his newborn close, warming her with his body and breath. It wasn't just a gesture of care. It was the moment he stepped fully into fatherhood. At the same time, Jenny was still flying for Alaska Airlines. In 1986, she had made history as one of the airline's first female captains. But by early 1995, trouble had started at work. Some colleagues didn't take her seriously. The situation escalated into a lawsuit against the airline. Scott was fully behind her, but it was a hard chapter. "I loved Scott and the kids more than anything," Jenny later said, "but in 1995 I fell into a deep depression. I just couldn't give the family the attention it needed." When Jenny left her job, the family's income dropped sharply. From the start, they'd built their life on a guide's wages and a pilot's salary. Scott stepped up where he could. He found housing, chose childcare, and handled the household when Jenny was gone. "I need to live within 20 minutes of the airport. That's all that really matters," he once said. Scott found their first house in Seattle, then a second on the west side of the city. After Andy and Katie Rose were born, he personally interviewed nannies, making sure everything at home stayed grounded when one of them was away. To help the kids cope with Scott's absences, the family created time boxes. Every day the dad was gone, the kids would peel off a date. Inside was a small toy or trinket. They also made prayer flags with handprints and totem drawings representing their family. Scott would hang the flags in his tent on expeditions and keep photos of the kids tucked near his sleeping bag. "It's hard for me when the family misses me," Scott told Northwest Wilderness Journal. "But I wouldn't say I get lonely. I live wherever I am." In that same interview, he spoke candidly about how his life had changed. "Now, the consequences of what I do carry more weight. I always thought of myself as a climber, and that I'd die a climber. Now, I just don't want to die." With time, Scott began to reflect more often on the balance between his love for the mountains and his love for his family. He still ventured out, but not as a reckless seeker. Now, he was a man watched by his children, a man who had someone to come home to. High in the Karakoram, where glaciers stretch like scars across the body of the planet, and every step forward is a fight against breathlessness, cold, and fear, Scott Fischer stood at the edge of what would become the most dangerous climb of his career. K2, the second highest mountain in the world, but first in fatality statistics. There were no chairs in base camp here, no warm Sherpa tea, no comforting icefall doctors, no margin for error. The Mountain Madness team had arrived in Pakistan, journeyed along dusty roads to the village of Ascole, and began the long trek up the Baltoro Glacier. The terrain was unforgiving. Trango Towers, Muztagh Tower, the great spires of the Karakoram all sent the same message. You are a guest here, and not always a welcome one. K2 revealed itself suddenly, at the confluence of the Baltoro and Godwin-Austen glaciers, towering, severe, and utterly uncompromising. This mountain is harsh, it's cruel, and if you can't handle it, you turn around and never come back, said Stacy Allison. The route to the summit began with the icefall, followed by a 30-meter rock step known as House's Chimney. Then Camp 1 at 6,000 meters, Camp 2, a steep ascent to the Black Pyramid, and the shoulder at 7,600. Above that, the infamous bottleneck. Scott had studied the maps, read the reports, but now he would face it for himself. Ed and I decided not to wait for perfect conditions, he recalled. They don't exist in the Karakoram. When there's a window, you go. The climb was brutal. Snow was deep and unstable. Avalanche danger loomed at every turn. Some climbers from other teams were already packing up. Then, on August 1st, two figures, Vladimir Balberdin and Gennady Kopeka, reached the summit without oxygen. Hope sparked in camp. Scott and Ed Viesturs climbed to Camp 3, where they heard via radio that three climbers, Alexei Nikiforov, Chantal Mauduit, and Torkia, had been trapped in Camp 4 for days, suffering from exposure and hunger. Scott and Ed set off to help immediately, but the weather turned fast. They were forced to retreat. At dawn, they saw Alexei making his way down. They took him into a tent, then pushed higher for the others. They moved through waist-deep snow. It felt like wading through molasses, Scott later said. They climbed rope together, Scott in front, Ed behind. They reached Tor and Chantal, got them moving, and brought them down. The summit was close, within striking distance, but they turned back. Saving lives came first. When the weather cleared again, climbers from different countries began working together, fixing lines and sharing resources. What was once separate became a team effort. Scott and Ed led the way through House's Chimney, reached the Black Pyramid, and once again descended. This time, it nearly ended in disaster. Scott slipped in the icefall and dislocated his shoulder. Almost a deja vu of what happened in Wyoming, he wrote to Janine. Pain shot through his body, but he didn't fall. They made it down to the moraine. Ed ran for a Russian doctor. Later, Scott would say, "We did everything right. We just got unlucky." Even then, Scott wasn't ready to quit. When the weather broke again, he and Ed climbed to Camp 3, then Camp 4. With them were Rob Hall, Gary Ball, a team of Mexicans, Swedes, and Charlie Mace. What united them all was a single drive to go higher. They moved in rope teams, step by step, up the deadly slope. A storm hit them on the summit. The descent turned into a battle of instinct. Snow erased their tracks. They navigated by trial and error. By evening, as they neared Camp 4, they heard a voice. "Rob? Gary?" It was a familiar accent. They had made it. "It was one of the biggest mistakes of my climbing career," Ed Viesturs would later write, "but also one of the most valuable lessons." Scott might have disagreed. For him, it wasn't a mistake. It was a necessity. To go past the edge, to do the impossible, to feel truly alive. They reached the summit of K2 that day, and then down again, into the storm, into the unknown. But someone was waiting below, and once again, Scott had proved to himself and to the world, even when everything is against you, you can make it if you go all the way. The mountain village of Namche Bazaar, tucked into a green bowl on the slopes of the Himalayas, was settling into the cool of evening. Stone houses, steep winding trails, tea houses, and wooden temples. This was the heart of Sherpa culture, and it was here, in this center of the world where memory of great feats still lives, that Sir Edmund Hillary, the man who first stood atop Everest in 1953, arrived by helicopter. 40 years had passed, and in the monastery above Namche, a celebration was underway in his honor. In the narrow alleyways amidst the light, color, and scent of this place, the author of this story worked alongside Scott Fischer. They were setting up Mountain Madness Base Camp, preparing for future ascents. Suddenly, the sound of long Tibetan horns echoed through the valley, monks calling for the evening ceremony. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting gold across the ridgelines. Fisher and his companions climbed toward the monastery and stopped at the heavy wooden doors, behind which came the hum of chanting and soft laughter. Then the doors swung open, and in a stream of golden light appeared Sir Edmund Hillary himself. Wrapped in ceremonial white khatas, tall and unhurried, with a thick crown of silver hair and a face lined with the years. He moved with quiet majesty, utterly at ease in the attention surrounding him. He stepped forward to greet a man with a smile and a firm handshake, mistaking him for someone else. Realizing the error, he apologized with warmth and stepped back, turning to welcome the others. And nearby stood Scott Fischer, unnoticed, unacknowledged, the man still chasing his own summit. The moment left a lasting impression. Sir Edmund, older now but still full of strength and clarity, had become a symbol of unshakable resolve, and as Scott watched him that evening, it felt as though a challenge had been renewed. He didn't complain. He didn't compare. But his eyes said one thing. What would Hillary do? They returned to the home of a Sherpani woman, where the dim light of a lantern flickered over a simple supper, tea with rum and yak butter, cinnamon rolls. Scott spoke to his friends, Ed and Lisa, about the meaning of fame and the deeper nature of mountaineering, not as a sport, but as a personal journey. He recalled how he had helped Paul Petzold, founder of the National Outdoor Leadership School, take one last trip to the Himalayas. Paul had been 82. He could no longer climb to the summit, but he could feel the wind, listen to chants at the Rongbuk Monastery, sip tea, and gaze at Everest. That was his summit. To Scott, it was proof. The mountains are not only measured in meters, but in inner space. Every climber discovers their own mountain again and again. Some seek glory, others silence. Scott chose the latter. Peter Hillary, Edmund's son, was there too, among the climbers still chasing their peak. In 1989, almost no one spoke of guides on Everest, but Scott was already moving toward that idea, a vision of combining leadership, responsibility, and integrity toward clients. He hadn't reached the summit yet, but he knew this was his path and it would lead there eventually. That evening in Namche Bazaar became a turning point, not because of anything spoken, but because of the quiet collision between two worlds, the past, embodied by Hillary, and the future, forming in the face of Fisher. When Scott asked himself, what would Hillary do? He wasn't looking for someone else's answer. He was reminding himself who he wanted to become. Everest, 1994, a rare moment when, on the highest mountain on Earth, there was silence. No crowds, no lines of tourists, no helicopters, just snow, wind, and a team determined to climb differently. Not for glory, not for profit, but for purity. This was the Sagarmatha, 1994 environmental expedition, the brainchild of Steve Gorlin, one of the most respected instructors from the Petzold School. In his lifetime, he had spent over 8 consecutive years, 440 weeks of courses, living in the wilderness. He took a parachute with him on commercial flights, dreamed of dying on another planet, and studied NASA's crew manuals in case he was ever invited into space. With him were other Bruces, the ironic nickname for alumni raised on the principles of minimalism and clean climbing. This time, their goal was Everest. They approached it with a sense of idealism. Packs on their backs, minimal gear, no oxygen, no fixed ropes, no luxuries. Everything essential they carried, everything unnecessary they left behind. Not even porters accompanied them. It was, as Gorlin called it, a clean game. Scott Fischer, drawn to the spirit of the expedition, felt his time had finally come. After his failed 1990 attempt, a year when nearly everyone else reached the summit, including Rob Hall, Wally Berg, and Pete Stange, Scott was ready. He was poised to step into the wave of commercial success on Everest, but do it his way, for real. Compared to other expeditions, theirs looked almost modest. They followed the standard route, the Khumbu Icefall, the Western CWM, the South Col. But they did it with reverence for the mountain. No turnkey camps, no chains of Sherpas, no cylinders stacked like towers. Their climb was slow, deliberate, honest. While Scott and his partner Steve Geip ascended, others in the group were busy cleaning the mountain, collecting trash, hauling down shredded tents and discarded ropes. Scott knew logistics weren't his strong suit. His energy could inspire people, but sometimes got in the way of details. Still, one thing he never doubted was his desire to stand on Everest. From the summit of Amadablam, he had once looked north, toward the torn ribbons of snow streaming off Everest's summit. He couldn't forget that mountain. It had called to him. On the mountain, things went to plan. Sherpas from Rob Hall's expedition watched as Scott's porters methodically hauled bags of trash down the slope. "Yes," they said quietly, "this is right." It was a silent nod of respect. Respect for the mountain and for those who had come not just to take, but to leave it better than they found it. The summit bid succeeded. Scott reached the top without oxygen, without incident, without fanfare. Simple, clean, exactly how he had always wanted it. It was a triumph, not just over altitude, but over the past. At a celebration in Kathmandu, the legendary Elizabeth Hawley came to document their achievement. She only listened to facts, recorded names, but even she was moved. 2,268 kilograms of trash removed from the mountain, she wrote. 150 empty oxygen bottles brought down. Sherpas received additional wages. It was one of the most environmentally conscious expeditions in Everest's history. Among elite climbers, it meant even more. Scott had proven he could not only keep up, he could set a new standard. He did it without oxygen, without accidents, without compromise. He hadn't stood on the sidelines of change. He had become part of it. The expedition was recognized as exemplary. Not only a successful summit, but a shining example of how Everest should be climbed with respect, with honesty, with integrity. And it was there, standing on the summit without oxygen, that Scott understood. He hadn't just climbed the mountain, he had become part of it. And the mountain had listened. You've stood on the highest point on earth, so what comes next? From here, the only direction is down, or upward, in a different sense, a spiritual ascent. In that moment, Scott Fischer seemed to be standing not just on the summit, but on the edge of his own destiny. He was known, respected. His company, Mountain Madness, was thriving. But inside, a new need was taking shape, to find the next summit, not in meters, but in meaning. On screen, clips from a television show called How to Outdoor flashed by. Scott, in sunglasses, a helmet, and a blue Mountain Madness jacket, spoke into the camera with a confident smile, his blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. "I'm Scott Fischer, professional climber and founder of Mountain Madness. I've climbed Everest and K2 without oxygen. I think we can teach anyone to climb." That energy mirrored where he was in 1995, riding the wave of success, yet fully aware that the future demanded something new. His team had just returned from Everest, an expedition that went flawlessly. Logistics ran smoothly. There were no major injuries. Clients were satisfied. And most importantly, Mountain Madness was now on everyone's radar. They had removed 2,268 kilograms of trash from the mountain, including 150 empty oxygen bottles. The Sherpas earned extra income. It wasn't just a climb. It was a statement, a declaration of environmental responsibility, and a bold entry into the world of commercial mountaineering. When journalist Elizabeth Hawley met with the team to document their success, Scott was his usual charming, playful self. He knew she only cared about the facts, but still tried to win her over. Beneath that lightness, though, was a man preparing for what came next. The success of 1994 carried a dual meaning. On one hand, it was a career high point. On the other, it proved Scott wasn't being left behind as commercial guiding on Everest exploded. His peers were already leading clients to the summit every season. Scott understood. To stay in the game, he had to evolve. Scott did what he needed to do, recalled climber Rob Hess. He didn't just summit Everest. He did it without oxygen, without issues. He proved he was keeping up. Now came the real question. What's next? The answer wasn't simple, because Scott Fischer was never a man content with a single summit. He wasn't just chasing peaks. He was chasing purpose. And now came a moment when he had to ask himself not just where to go, but why. This chapter becomes symbolic. It shows Scott not just as a climber, but as a man standing at the threshold of transformation. He didn't yet know that the coming year would change everything, but he could feel it. The peak had been reached, and a new path was calling toward something greater. Spring 1996. Scott Fischer stood on the summit of Everest. Another victory? Not quite. This climb was meant to be his triumph, his moment of glory, the culmination of a long journey. Instead, it became something that would forever change the world's understanding of commercial mountaineering. It was his final ascent. From the moment the expedition began, everything felt familiar. Base camp, preparation, acclimatization. But something was in the air, not just the shifting weather, but a quiet tension building inside Scott, as if something within him knew. This journey would be different. He didn't know he was leading his team into the heart of one of the deadliest disasters in Everest history, an event whose scale would shake the world. Scott, along with 7 other climbers, died on the slopes of the mountain. His clients, against all odds, made it down alive. It became the subject of international headlines, analysis, debate. For the first time, an Everest expedition didn't capture global attention for records, but for tragedy. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Books followed. Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. The Climb by Anatoly Bukreev. Then came the documentaries, the feature films. Millions watched the story unfold on screens around the world, but lost in the noise, amid the shouting and the grief, was one man, Scott Fischer. A man who didn't die for fame, but for an idea. When the news reached his sister Lisa, she couldn't believe it. "Scott can't get down," she sobbed into the phone. The voice on the other end was just as stunned, but the paper says it was a success. And so the unraveling began. Scott had started his final climb with the calm determination of someone who had found their place in the world. One TV program closed with a shot of him, just returned from the mountain, lying in the snow with arms outstretched and a wide open smile on his face. "I love this," he told the camera. That was him, real, strong, certain, and it was the truth. In spring 1996, Mountain Madness was leading another commercial expedition to Everest. It was a carefully organized project. Clients, Sherpas, partners, everything was running smoothly until the mountain began to shift the terms. The monsoon came early, temperatures dropped, snowdrifts grew more dangerous, summit windows grew narrower, but there was no turning back. Scott climbed. He reached the summit, but it was already 3:30 p.m. Too late to linger. His clients had begun their descent. He should have done the same, but he stayed. He exchanged quick greetings with colleagues. "Tag the summit, turn around," one climber later recalled. Everyone knew, every minute counted. Scott knew it too, but still, he went on. Maybe to leave one final mark. Maybe because he didn't know how to do anything else. He couldn't know, no one could, that within hours the wind would rise, the sky would shut down, and Everest would become a trap. Then came the silence. No radio, no word, no sign of where he was. The storm closed in. Down below, climbers tried to gather information. Everyone hoped, everyone waited. But it became clearer by the hour. He wasn't coming down. Robert Birkby was packing for a trip to Wyoming when the newspaper arrived. Scott Fischer's team summits Everest. He smiled, set his sleeping bag aside, picked up the phone, and heard Lisa sobbing. In a heartbeat, the headline's meaning changed completely. "Scott can't get down," like a verdict. Then came the shock. Then the media storm. Then the books, the films, the endless discussion. But what happened on Everest wasn't just a tragedy. It was a dividing line between man and mountain, between the work of true guides and the rise of commercial risk, between courage and recklessness, between life and death. And somewhere up there on that slope, Scott Fischer remains, not as a victim, but as a symbol, as a voice still echoing, "I love this," because he truly did, because he lived for it, because he didn't die for a record, he died for an idea. This was his last climb, and it became eternal. More than 20 days had passed since the tragedy on Everest when people began to gather in Seattle. They came from all over the world, friends, colleagues, clients, even strangers who had once been inspired by Scott Fischer. His death had been a blow, but also a reason to come together and remember the kind of man he was, vibrant, powerful, full of light. "I had no idea how many people knew Scott and wanted to honor him," said Jean Price, his former wife. Even Larry, the local milkman, asked if he could attend. That said a lot about Scott's reach as a human being. The first memorial was held in a city park not far from the Fisher-Price family home. People sat on the grass sharing stories, laughing, crying. It was an open remembrance, more like a celebration of life than a formal service, raw, warm, and authentic, just like Scott. The second memorial came later on Bainbridge Island, among towering cedars and firs. The Kiana Lodge, a center of native culture, became the quiet ground for goodbye. Rows of white folding chairs descended toward the shoreline. A soft breeze stirred Buddhist prayer flags strung between trees. Nothing there resembled the icy slopes of Everest, except for death itself, which had brought them all together. But after the storm didn't mean the end. The Mountain Madness team soon returned to the mountains. At first, the weather turned brutal. High winds, zero visibility. They tried to retreat, but even the descent became dangerous. A guide from a neighboring camp came out to help. Then, when the skies cleared, they climbed again. But something had shifted. We were exhausted. The clients were exhausted, said Rob Hess. The group made a sober decision to turn back. Better a beer in Talkeetna, they said, and left the mountain behind. Down below, they were met by Korean climbers who fed them hot noodles and tea. Only then did the truth settle in. They had been lucky. Others hadn't. As they descended further, they saw a helicopter rising into the sky, lifting the bodies of 3 climbers who had frozen to death in a crevasse. Denali had not let everyone go. Back in Seattle, Scott wrote to Lena Gammelgard, "I'm back from Alaska. You know what? McKinley won this time. That was the worst weather I've ever seen." That was his truth. No bravado, no false front. Scott kept working, mostly from the office now, handling expedition logistics. He was spending more time with his kids, but finances were tight. Gene's legal battle with the airline dragged on. The couple discussed selling their West Seattle home and moving to North Bend, closer to the mountains. They began scouting houses in the area. Scott liked the idea of being near the peaks, even if he wasn't climbing them as often anymore. His world was shifting. He hadn't lost his fire, but he was learning how to live outside the storm. "I'm afraid of making a bad decision and dying in the mountains," he said in an interview. "I'm afraid of not coming home, of leaving my kids without a father." It was honest. It was real. No, not everything can be accounted for. But the clients on his 1996 Everest expedition, they came home alive. That was Scott's doing. His instinct, his experience, his sense of responsibility. He did everything he could, maybe more. Fischer always drew people in. His energy, his charisma, his quiet force, they made him the center of any room. He was, as one friend would say, the last of the pirates. Not in a romantic sense of danger, but in the relentless drive to live fully, honestly, brilliantly.